tropical night hung heavy over Guam's Fonte Plateau as July 25, 1944 slipped toward its darkest hours. Through dense jungle vegetation, 200 Japanese soldiers moved with practiced stealth, their footsteps muffled by thick undergrowth and the constant symphony of nocturnal insects. They had spent hours maneuvering into position, gradually tightening an invisible noose around the scattered defensive positions where exhausted men of the 3rd Marine Division tried to snatch moments of rest after days of relentless combat. These Americans were worn down in ways that transcended mere physical fatigue. Their ammunition stocks were dwindling, their nerves stretched taut by the unending pressure of battle. Inside his crude command post, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wensel listened to the sporadic crackle of his field radio as situation reports filtered in from positions spread across the plateau. The picture they painted was grim. His Marines were dangerously dispersed, holding a perimeter that any military textbook would declare indefensible given the circumstances. The doctrine was unambiguous about situations like this. When surrounded and facing 3-1 odds, a commander should consolidate forces, establish a tight defensive line, and hope reinforcements arrive before the enemy strikes. The Japanese had conducted their preparations with meticulous attention to detail. Through careful reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, they had mapped the precise locations where American soldiers were sleeping, identified which sectors of the defensive line showed the greatest vulnerability, and plotted which supply routes could be most easily severed. As Lieutenant General Takashi reviewed the final preparations for his assault, he felt the confidence of a commander who had planned for every contingency and anticipated every American response. His forces would strike with overwhelming violence, shattering enemy morale and driving the survivors back to their landing beaches in chaos. What the general had failed to consider, what his staff officers had not factored into their calculations, was the unique character of the men they were about to engage. The opening salvo came at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning. A Japanese artillery shell shrieked through the darkness, its distinctive whistle slicing through the humid air before detonating in the jungle canopy 50 yards from Wensel's position. The lieutenant colonel pressed himself flat against the muddy floor of his command post as the ground trembled beneath him. His intelligence officers had predicted the timing of this assault with remarkable accuracy, but the sheer violence of the opening bombardment exceeded every estimate they had prepared. Within seconds, his radio erupted with urgent transmissions from across the plateau. The 3rd Battalion was receiving concentrated mortar fire from positions to the north. The 2nd Battalion reported enemy infantry movement through the eastern tree line. Most alarming, Japanese infiltrators had somehow breached the outer defenses and were already engaging the hospital compound near Asan Point with small arms fire. Wensel reached for his handset and began issuing orders with a calmness that seemed almost surreal given the chaos erupting around him. He had learned this discipline during the savage fighting on Bougainville, where he had witnessed how panic in the opening moments of an enemy assault could destroy a defensive position more effectively than any artillery barrage. His voice remained steady and measured as he directed his battalion commanders to implement the defensive plans they had rehearsed during the previous days. Each order delivered with the quiet authority that had earned him the unwavering respect of every Marine under his command. From his position on the eastern slope of the plateau, Captain Frank Bibb's voice cut through the radio static with a report that confirmed Wensel's gravest concerns. Bibb's battalion was under assault by what appeared to be an entire regiment of Japanese infantry, supported by knee mortars and machine guns that had been carefully positioned during daylight hours. The enemy had clearly studied American defensive patterns with great care, identifying every foxhole, every supply cache, every vulnerable point in the Marine perimeter. They were executing a textbook encirclement maneuver designed to isolate American units from their command structure and destroy them piecemeal, for dawn could bring the advantages of daylight combat. Lieutenant General Takashi had based his tactical planning on experiences from European theaters of war, where encircled forces typically chose between surrender and retreat when confronted with overwhelming numerical superiority. What he had failed to account for was the fundamental difference in how American Marines responded when they found their backs against the wall. As the first waves of Japanese infantry crashed against the outer defensive positions, something began to happen that did not conform to the patterns Takashi's staff had predicted. Instead of requesting permission to withdraw or attempting to break out of the encirclement, individual Marine units began to fight with escalating ferocity, as if the desperate nature of their situation had somehow transformed them into something more dangerous rather than less. Private First Class James O'Connor crouched in his foxhole on the southeastern edge of the perimeter, watching tracer rounds arc through the darkness like malevolent fireflies. He had been on Guam for exactly 11 days, and this was the first time he had witnessed enemy soldiers advancing in organized formations rather than the desperate isolated attacks that had characterized the previous week of fighting. Through the scope of his M1 Garand rifle, he could distinguish 3 distinct waves of Japanese infantry, each larger and more densely packed than the one before it. The sight should have filled him with terror, but instead he felt something entirely different. A cold, focused anger that seemed to sharpen his senses and steady his hands in ways his training had never quite achieved. The Japanese had positioned their heaviest weapons to target Marine artillery positions first, correctly understanding that American defensive doctrine relied heavily on coordinated fire support. But Wensel had anticipated this tactic. During the previous afternoon, he had ordered his howitzers relocated to secondary positions that did not appear on any captured American maps. When enemy mortars began falling on what should have been gun emplacements, the Marine artillery crews were already establishing their firing positions 800 yards away in concealed locations. Sergeant Major William Hayes, a grizzled veteran who had been dropping artillery shells on enemy positions since the early days of Guadalcanal, coordinated the counter-battery fire with methodical precision. His forward observers called in coordinates through encrypted radio channels, while Japanese infiltrators searched desperately for the source of the devastating American fire support that was tearing through their assault formations. The 155mm howitzers began their deadly work at 3:45 in the morning. Each shell was carefully aimed at the muzzle flashes and movement patterns that revealed enemy positions in the darkness. The Japanese had committed nearly their entire strategic reserve to this single assault, convinced that one overwhelming night attack would shatter American morale and force a general retreat to the landing beaches. Intelligence reports had assured Takashi that the Marines were exhausted, undersupplied, and psychologically broken after 2 weeks of continuous combat. What his staff had failed to understand was that American units under extreme pressure did not fragment and flee. Instead, they consolidated, adapted, and became exponentially more dangerous. At 4 o'clock, the first wave of Japanese infantry reached the outer wire of the Marine defensive perimeter. They had advanced through terrain that military doctrine considered impassable for organized units, using jungle paths and ravines that did not appear on American tactical maps. The assault should have achieved complete tactical surprise, overwhelming the scattered Marine positions before coordinated resistance could be organized. Instead, the Japanese soldiers found themselves walking into carefully prepared fields of fire that had been registered and tested during the previous week. Machine gun teams commanded by corporals and privates first class opened fire with the disciplined precision of men who had spent months training for exactly this scenario. The Browning M1917 water-cooled machine guns delivered sustained fire at 600 rounds per minute, creating interlocking patterns of destruction that no infantry formation could cross. The Japanese had planned for American resistance, but they had not planned for American fury. Through his field glasses, Captain Bibb watched as the enemy's second wave attempted to exploit gaps that should have opened in the Marine lines after the initial assault. Japanese tactical doctrine called for continuous pressure that would eventually find weak points in any defensive position, allowing follow-up forces to exploit breakthrough points and collapse the entire perimeter from within. But the weak points were not appearing. Every position that came under heavy attack seemed to become stronger rather than weaker as movement adjacent areas moved to reinforce threatened sectors without waiting for orders from higher command. The technological advantages that American forces enjoyed during daylight operations were supposed to be neutralized by darkness and close quarters fighting. Japanese planners had specifically chosen night assault tactics to prevent American units from employing their superior artillery, air support, and armored vehicles, but the Marines had spent months adapting their equipment and tactics for exactly these conditions. Radio communications remained clear and effective. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting arms continued to function with devastating efficiency. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese third wave was advancing through the scattered remnants of their first two assault formations. The attack had cost them nearly 800 casualties in less than 2 hours, but Takashi remained convinced that American resistance was weakening. His field commanders reported that Marine positions were still holding, but surely this was simply the final convulsions of a defeated force that would collapse with one more concentrated push. What the Japanese general did not understand was that he had just encountered the most dangerous phenomenon in infantry warfare United States. Marines who had decided they were not going to retreat under any circumstances. Lieutenant General Takashi studied the battlefield reports filtering back from his assault commanders and felt the first cold touch of doubt creep into his calculations. His staff had assured him that American resistance would crumble within 3 hours of sustained attack, but the sun was beginning to rise over the Fonte Plateau, and Marine positions remained intact across the entire front. More disturbing were the casualty figures that his regimental commanders were reluctantly reporting through coded radio transmissions. The 29th Infantry Division had already lost nearly half its effective strength, and the planned breakthrough to the American hospital had stalled completely. At 5:30, the Japanese general committed his final reserve, sending his most experienced infantry regiment in a desperate attempt to break through the Marine perimeter before full daylight exposed his forces to American artillery and air attack. These were soldiers who had fought through the China campaign and survived the brutal Pacific Island battles of the previous 2 years. They advanced with the disciplined precision of veterans who understood that this assault would determine whether organized Japanese resistance on Guam would continue or collapse entirely. But something had gone fundamentally wrong with Japanese intelligence estimates about American defensive capabilities. The Marines were not behaving like a cornered and demoralized force awaiting evacuation. Instead, they were fighting with the coordinated intensity of a unit that had decided to hold its ground regardless of the cost. Radio intercepts revealed something that shocked Japanese commanders. American officers were actually calling for additional ammunition and requesting permission to launch counterattacks against Japanese positions that had been weakened by the failed night assault. Sergeant Taro Matsui led his 20-man infiltration squad through a narrow ravine that American reconnaissance had apparently missed during their initial survey of the plateau. His mission was to penetrate the hospital compound near Asan Point and eliminate the medical personnel who were treating wounded Marines. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized that destroying enemy medical capabilities would force American units to choose between abandoning their wounded or committing additional forces to hospital defense, creating opportunities for exploitation elsewhere along the perimeter. The infiltration team had trained for this specific mission during 3 weeks of preparation on a mock-up facility constructed behind Japanese lines. They knew the exact layout of the hospital compound, the location of every tent and supply bunker, the shift patterns of the medical staff, and the defensive positions that Marine guards were likely to establish around the perimeter. What they had not anticipated was encountering a reinforced squad of Marines who had been specifically assigned to anti-infiltration duties after intelligence reports suggested exactly this type of attack. Private First Class O'Connor had been moved to the hospital security detail 6 hours before the Japanese assault began, part of a defensive adjustment that Lieutenant Colonel Wensel had implemented based on intercepted enemy radio traffic. The young Marine had never participated in close quarters combat against enemy infiltrators, but his training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. When Matsu's squad emerged from the ravine at 6 o'clock in the morning, they found themselves facing prepared positions, defended by Marines who had been expecting. The firefight that erupted around the hospital compound lasted exactly 17 minutes and demonstrated the fundamental problem that was destroying Japanese assault capabilities across the entire plateau. Individual American units were not simply defending fixed positions, but were actively adapting their tactics based on real-time battlefield developments. Marine squads were repositioning to support each other without waiting for orders from higher command, creating interlocking fields of fire that eliminated the gaps and weak points that Japanese infiltration tactics were designed to exploit. Captain Bibb received reports from his forward observers that Japanese supply columns were beginning to retreat from advanced positions they had occupied during the night assault. Enemy ammunition expenditure had been enormous during the first 5 hours of fighting, and Japanese logistics capabilities were proving inadequate to sustain the intensity of combat that their assault plan required. More significantly, intercepted radio communications revealed that Japanese commanders were beginning to lose contact with many of their subordinate units as American artillery systematically destroyed enemy command posts and communication equipment. The technological advantages that American forces had developed during 2 years of Pacific combat were proving decisive in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. Marine artillery crews were using forward observer techniques and radio coordination procedures that allowed them to deliver accurate fire support within minutes of receiving target coordinates. Japanese forces, accustomed to fighting enemies with limited artillery capabilities, found themselves under constant bombardment from weapons they could not locate or counter. At 6:45, Wensel authorized the deployment of M4 Sherman tanks that had been held in reserve during the night fighting. The 5 medium tanks advanced along predetermined routes that had been cleared of obstacles during the previous week. Their 75mm guns and coaxial machine guns engaging Japanese positions at ranges that enemy infantry weapons could not match. The tanks moved slowly through the jungle terrain, but their presence fundamentally altered the tactical balance of the engagement. Japanese anti-tank capabilities on Guam consisted primarily of individual soldiers carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges, weapons that required extremely close approach to be effective. The tanks operated in coordination with Marine infantry squads that prevented enemy soldiers from reaching effective range, while their armor protection allowed them to advance into areas where unprotected infantry could not survive. Each Sherman carried sufficient ammunition to engage targets for hours of continuous combat, providing sustained fire support that Japanese forces had no way to neutralize. The psychological impact of American armored vehicles proved as significant as their tactical effectiveness. Japanese soldiers who had endured hours of artillery bombardment and machine gun fire found themselves facing weapons platforms that seemed invulnerable to their available anti-tank methods. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers later revealed that many units began to lose cohesion when tank-supported Marine counterattacks began developing along multiple sectors of the front. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant General Takashi was receiving reports that his assault forces were beginning to withdraw from their advanced positions without authorization from higher command. Individual Japanese units were making independent decisions to retreat when their tactical situations became untenable, a breakdown in military discipline that indicated the complete failure of the counteroffensive. The general had committed his entire strategic reserve to this single attack, and the collapse of coordinated resistance meant that organized Japanese defense of Guam was effectively finished. The hospital compound that Sergeant Matsui had attempted to capture remained securely in American hands. The veteran Japanese infiltration specialist lay dead in a drainage ditch 50 yards from his objective, killed by a 19-year-old Marine private who had been in combat for less than 2 weeks. Around him, the scattered equipment and bodies of his infiltration squad marked the farthest point of Japanese penetration into the American defensive perimeter. Captain Bibb established radio contact with his battalion commander and requested permission to pursue the retreating Japanese forces, but Wensel ordered all Marine units to maintain their defensive positions until the full extent of enemy withdrawal could be determined. American casualties had been surprisingly light, considering the intensity of the night assault, but ammunition expenditure had been enormous, and resupply operations would be necessary before any major offensive action could be undertaken. The sun climbed higher over the Fonte Plateau, illuminating a battlefield where the strategic balance of power on Guam had shifted decisively during 6 hours of darkness. Japanese forces that had begun the night with overwhelming numerical superiority were now scattered, demoralized, and incapable of launching another coordinated attack. The Marines who had been surrounded and outnumbered had not only survived, but had effectively destroyed Japanese offensive capabilities in a single engagement. As morning light cast long shadows across the Fonte Plateau, Lieutenant Colonel Wensel surveyed the battlefield that had been transformed during 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese bodies lay scattered across the approaches to Marine positions in patterns that revealed the tactical story of a failed assault. The enemy had committed everything to this single attack and had lost not just the battle, but their capacity to mount organized resistance anywhere on Guam. Wensel's radio operator handed him a message from division headquarters authorizing an immediate advance to secure the plateau and eliminate remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. Private First Class O'Connor emerged from his foxhole near the hospital compound and began the grim task of counting enemy casualties in his sector. 17 Japanese soldiers had died attempting to breach the medical facility, including the infiltration specialist whose equipment and documents would provide valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. The young Marine had fired his M1 Garand Rifle 40 3 times during the night engagement, and every round had been aimed with the precision that months of training had drilled into his muscle memory. He felt no satisfaction in the killing, but he understood that his actions had saved the lives of wounded Marines who would have died without medical treatment. Captain Bibb received orders to advance his battalion toward the high ground that Japanese forces had abandoned during their chaotic withdrawal. The enemy retreat had been so hasty that valuable equipment and supplies had been left behind, including artillery pieces that could have been used to defend the plateau if Japanese commanders had maintained better control over their units. Marine intelligence teams would spend days cataloging the abandoned materials, but the most significant discovery was the complete breakdown of Japanese command and control capabilities that the failed assault had revealed. The M4 Sherman tanks that had proven so decisive during the final phase of the night battle began their advance up the slopes of the Fonte Plateau at 8:30 in the morning. The 5 medium tanks moved in coordinated formation, their crews scanning for anti-tank positions and prepared obstacles that might slow their progress. But Japanese defensive preparations had focused entirely on stopping American infantry attacks, and the rapid collapse of organized resistance meant that most anti-tank weapons had been abandoned or destroyed during the retreat. Lieutenant General Takashi established his final command post in a cave complex on the northern edge of the plateau, surrounded by the scattered remnants of units that had been decimated during the failed counteroffensive. His staff officers reported that effective Japanese strength on Guam had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 combat capable soldiers, most of whom were isolated in small groups without communication or coordination with higher command. The general recognized that organized resistance was no longer possible, but Japanese military doctrine demanded that he continue fighting until death rather than surrender. Marine artillery crews began the systematic destruction of suspected Japanese positions throughout the Plateau region, using coordinates provided by forward observers and aerial reconnaissance. The 155mm howitzers delivered high, explosive shells with devastating accuracy, eliminating cave complexes and fortified positions that might have sheltered enemy forces attempting to reorganize for continued resistance. Each artillery mission was carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties, while ensuring that Japanese military capabilities were completely eliminated. By noon on July 27th, advanced elements of the 21st Marines had reached positions that overlooked the entire northern section of Guam. The tactical situation had reversed completely from the desperate defensive fighting of 2 nights earlier. American forces now controlled the high ground and possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air support. Japanese forces were reduced to small groups hiding in caves and jungle areas, incapable of coordinated action, and gradually being eliminated by systematic search and destroy operations. Captain Bibb's company encountered the largest remaining concentration of Japanese resistance at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when approximately 60 enemy soldiers attempted to establish a defensive position in a ravine that provided natural protection from American artillery. The engagement lasted 45 minutes and demonstrated the fundamental tactical changes that had occurred since the failed night assault. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate courage, but lacked the weapons, ammunition, and coordination necessary to stop advancing Marine units supported by tanks and artillery. The death of Lieutenant General Takashi occurred during this final engagement when the Japanese commander attempted to lead a last, desperate charge against American positions. Marine riflemen killed the general and his staff officers with precise fire that eliminated Japanese leadership and effectively ended organized resistance in this sector. The death of the senior Japanese commander symbolized the complete collapse of enemy defensive capabilities and marked the beginning of the phase of operations to secure Guam. Private First Class O'Connor participated in the advance that cleared the ravine where Takashi had made his final stand. The young Marine had evolved from a frightened replacement to a combat veteran during less than 24 hours of intensive fighting. His actions during the hospital defense had earned recognition from his squad leader and demonstrated the transformation that combat experience produced in American soldiers who survived their first major engagement. The confidence and tactical knowledge he had gained would prove valuable during the remaining operations to secure the island. Marine engineers began clearing routes for supply vehicles and establishing communication lines that would support continued operations against scattered Japanese resistance throughout Guam. The logistical capabilities that American forces possessed gave them decisive advantages in sustained combat operations. While Japanese soldiers were reduced to scavenging for food and ammunition, Marine units received regular resupply of everything necessary to maintain combat effectiveness for weeks or months of additional fighting. By 6 o'clock in the evening on July 29th, organized Japanese resistance on the Fonte Plateau had been completely eliminated. Marine patrols reported contact with only isolated individual and small groups that posed no threat to American control of the strategic high ground. The battle that had begun with Japanese forces surrounding and outnumbering American defensive positions had ended with the complete destruction of enemy offensive capabilities and the establishment of secure American control over the most important terrain features on Guam. Lieutenant Colonel Wensel established command post in the cave complex that Lieutenant General Takashi had used during his final hours, symbolically occupying the position from which Japanese resistance had been coordinated. The American victory had been achieved through superior tactics, technology, and training, but most importantly, through the fighting spirit of individual Marines who had refused to be defeated regardless of the odds they faced. The 21st Marines had demonstrated that American infantry units possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had fundamentally misunderstood. The aftermath of the battle revealed casualty figures that told the complete story of the engagement. Japanese forces had lost approximately 3,200 soldiers killed, with virtually all surviving personnel either wounded or scattered in small groups throughout the island. American casualties totaled fewer than 200 killed and wounded, a ratio that demonstrated the decisive nature of the tactical victory. More significantly, the destruction of Japanese offensive capabilities meant that remaining enemy forces on Guam could offer only token resistance to American operations designed to secure the entire island. Captain Bibb submitted his after-action report describing the tactical innovations that had proven decisive during the night engagement. American defensive doctrine had evolved during months of Pacific combat to emphasize flexibility, coordination, and aggressive response to enemy attacks. The Marines who had held the Fonte Plateau represented the culmination of military training and experience that had transformed American infantry into the most effective fighting force in the Pacific theater. The silence that settled over the Fonte Plateau on the morning of July 30th carried a weight that pressed against the consciousness of every Marine who had survived the night that changed everything. Private First Class O'Connor sat on the edge of his foxhole, cleaning his M1 Garand with the methodical precision that combat had taught him. But his hands moved automatically while his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed and done. The hospital compound where he had killed his first enemy soldier lay peaceful in the morning sunlight. But the memory of muzzle flashes and desperate voices calling for ammunition would follow him for decades to come. Captain Bibb walked among his men, checking on wounded Marines and ensuring that ammunition and medical supplies were being distributed properly. But he could see in their faces the same haunted expression that he recognized in his own reflection. They had accomplished something extraordinary during 6 hours of desperate fighting. But the cost of that achievement was written in the exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. These were men who had looked into the face of their own mortality and discovered reserves of courage and determination they had not known they possessed. The bodies of Japanese soldiers scattered across the plateau told a story of tactical miscalculation and strategic failure that would be studied by military historians for generations. Lieutenant General Takashi had committed his entire force to a single assault that should have succeeded according to every principle of conventional warfare. The Americans had been outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from reinforcement. Yet something fundamental in the character of Marine Corps training and leadership had transformed what should have been a defeat into a victory so complete that organized Japanese resistance on Guam had been permanently eliminated. Lieutenant Colonel Wensel established a temporary memorial near his command post, using a piece of shrapnel, torn metal, to mark the spot where 17 Marines had died defending positions they refused to abandon. The names of the dead were etched into the makeshift monument with a combat knife, creating a permanent record of sacrifice that would outlast the war itself. Wensel understood that his men needed time to process what they had experienced, but the tactical situation required continued operations to secure the remainder of the island before scattered Japanese forces could reorganize. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat Marines who had been wounded during the night engagement, but the hospital near Asen Point that Sergeant Matsui had died attempting to capture remained fully operational throughout the battle. The Japanese infiltration mission that should have eliminated American medical capabilities had failed completely, ensuring that wounded Marines received immediate treatment that saved dozens of lives. Navy corpsmen moved among the casualties with the quiet professionalism that made them legends among the infantry they served, providing care that transformed potentially fatal wounds into recoverable injuries. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect perceptions throughout the Pacific theater. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo had promised that the counteroffensive on Guam would demonstrate Japanese military superiority and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Instead, the complete destruction of Japanese offensive capabilities had revealed fundamental weaknesses in enemy strategic planning and the growing strength of American military capabilities. Private First Class O'Connor received word that his actions during the hospital defense had earned him a Bronze Star Medal with Combat V device, recognition that felt surreal to a young man who had been terrified throughout most of the engagement. His squad leader explained that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite being afraid, a lesson that would serve him well during the remainder of his military service. The medal represented not just individual heroism, but the collective achievement of Marines who had refused to be defeated regardless of the odds they faced. Marine intelligence teams spent days interrogating captured Japanese soldiers and examining abandoned equipment to understand how enemy forces had achieved tactical surprise despite American surveillance capabilities. The infiltration routes and assault techniques that Japanese commanders had employed revealed sophisticated planning and preparation that should have resulted in a successful attack. The failure of such a well-conceived operation demonstrated that American defensive doctrine had evolved to counter enemy tactical innovations through superior training and leadership. Captain Bibb submitted detailed recommendations for tactical modifications based on lessons learned during the night engagement. American defensive positions needed better communication between adjacent units and improved coordination with supporting artillery and armor. The success of Japanese infiltration attempts highlighted the need for additional anti-infiltration patrols and better early warning systems. Most importantly, the battle had demonstrated that Marine units performed best when individual initiative was encouraged rather than suppressed by rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The reconstruction of Guam began immediately after organized Japanese resistance ended, with Marine engineers and Seabees working to repair damage caused by weeks of combat operations. The airfield that would eventually support B-29 bombers attacking the Japanese mainland was expanded and improved using lessons learned from previous Pacific campaigns. Local civilians who had survived Japanese occupation were provided with medical care and supplies, beginning the process of restoring civil government under American administration. Lieutenant Colonel Wensel received promotion to full colonel and assignment to divisional staff, recognition of leadership abilities that had proven decisive during the most critical phase of the Guam campaign. His tactical innovations and calm decision-making under extreme pressure had prevented a potential disaster and transformed a defensive engagement into a decisive victory. The techniques he had developed would be incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine and taught at military schools for decades after the war ended. The strategic implications of the Fonte Plateau battle extended throughout the Pacific theater, where Japanese commanders realized that American infantry capabilities had evolved far beyond their previous estimates. The complete destruction of numerically superior forces in a single engagement demonstrated that traditional tactical approaches were inadequate against an enemy that combined superior technology with exceptional training and leadership. Japanese defensive planning for remaining Pacific strongholds would be fundamentally altered by analysis of what had occurred on Guam. Private First Class O'Connor was evacuated to a hospital in Hawaii for treatment of wounds that were more serious than initially diagnosed, but he would return to combat operations within 3 months and participate in the assault on Iwo Jima. The experience of surviving his first major engagement had transformed him from a replacement soldier into a combat veteran whose skills and knowledge would prove valuable. During subsequent operations, his personal evolution reflected the broader transformation of American military capabilities that was occurring throughout the Pacific War. The final casualty count revealed the true magnitude of what had been accomplished during 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese forces had lost 200 soldiers killed, with fewer than 100 prisoners taken and the remainder scattered in small groups throughout the island. American casualties totaled 190, 7 killed and wounded, a ratio that demonstrated not just tactical superiority, but fundamental differences in military effectiveness that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The Marines who had held the Fonte Plateau understood that they had participated in something historically significant, but the full implications of their achievement would only become clear decades later when military historians analyzed the engagement in the context of Pacific theater operations. They had demonstrated that American infantry possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had completely misunderstood, capabilities that would prove decisive in every subsequent campaign of the war. 3 months after the battle, Colonel Wensel stood in the operations center of the newly constructed air base that now occupied the ground where Japanese forces had made their final desperate assault. The massive runway stretched across terrain that had been soaked with blood during 6 hours of savage fighting, but now B-29 superfortresses taxied along the concrete surface, preparing for bombing missions against the Japanese mainland. The transformation of Guam from contested battleground to strategic battle base represented the broader shift in Pacific theater operations that the Marine victory had made possible. Corporal O'Connor, now recovered from his wounds and promoted, served as a squad leader in the 4th Marine Division, preparing for the assault on Iwo Jima. His experience during the night engagement on Guam had earned him recognition as one of the most tactically skilled, non-commissioned officers in his battalion, but more importantly had given him the confidence and combat knowledge necessary to train replacement Marines who would face similar challenges in future operations. The lessons he had learned while defending the hospital compound were now being passed on to young Marines who would carry those techniques into the final campaigns of the Pacific War. The tactical innovations that had proven decisive during the Fonte Plateau engagement were being incorporated into Marine Corps' doctrine through training programs established at bases throughout the Pacific. Officers and senior enlisted personnel who had participated in the battle served as instructors, sharing practical knowledge about defensive coordination, anti-infiltration techniques, and the integration of artillery and armor support. The institutional memory of the Corps was being enriched by combat experience that would influence military thinking for decades beyond the end of the war. Major Bibb, now commanding a battalion, reviewed after action reports from recent operations that demonstrated how widely the tactical lessons of Guam had been adopted. Marine units throughout the Pacific were employing defensive techniques that emphasized flexibility and aggressive response to enemy attacks rather than passive resistance from fixed positions. The psychological transformation that had occurred during the night battle was being replicated in training programs that taught Marines to view being surrounded not as a prelude to defeat, but as an opportunity to destroy enemy forces that had exposed themselves to concentrated firepower. Japanese military analysts studying the catastrophic failure of their Guam counteroffensive reached conclusions that fundamentally altered strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Intelligence reports revealed that American infantry capabilities had evolved far beyond previous estimates, particularly in the areas of small unit leadership, tactical coordination, and the integration of supporting weapons. The complete destruction of numerically superior forces in a single engagement had demonstrated that traditional Japanese tactics were inadequate against an enemy that combined superior technology with exceptional training and morale. The strategic implications of the Fonte Plateau battle influenced Japanese defensive preparations on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands themselves. Military commanders recognized that frontal assaults against prepared American positions would result in catastrophic casualties without achieving tactical objectives. New defensive doctrines emphasized prolonged resistance from prepared positions rather than counteroffensive operations designed to drive American forces back to their landing beaches. The psychological impact of the Guam defeat had convinced Japanese planners that their forces could no longer achieve decisive victories against American infantry in open combat. Marine casualties from the night engagement who had been evacuated to hospitals in Hawaii and the continental United States became inadvertent ambassadors for the evolving capabilities of American ground forces. Their accounts of the battle, shared with medical personnel, visiting dignitaries, and war correspondents, contributed to a growing understanding that the Pacific War had entered a new phase characterized by American tactical and technological superiority. The transformation of young replacement soldiers into combat, hardened veterans during a single night of fighting demonstrated the effectiveness of Marine Corps training programs and leadership development. The technological advantages that had proven decisive during the Fonte Plateau engagement were being replicated and improved throughout the Pacific theater. Radio communication systems that had allowed Marine units to coordinate defensive fires and mutual support were being upgraded with more powerful transmitters and better encryption capabilities. Artillery techniques developed during the battle were being standardized and taught to crews supporting operations from the Philippines to the Central Pacific. Tank infantry coordination procedures were being refined based on lessons learned during the successful defense against Japanese infiltration attacks. Colonel Wensel received assignment to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, where his tactical expertise was employed in planning operations for the final phase of the war against Japan. His analysis of the Guam engagement influenced strategic thinking about amphibious assault techniques and defensive operations on future objectives. The institutional knowledge he had gained during 6 hours of desperate fighting was now being applied to campaigns that would involve hundreds of thousands of American personnel and determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The reconstruction of Guam proceeded with remarkable speed, transforming the island from a devastated battleground into a major military installation capable of supporting strategic bomber operations against Japan. The civilian population that had survived Japanese occupation was provided with medical care, food, and housing, while civil government was re-established under American administration. The contrast between Japanese occupation policies and American reconstruction efforts provided a powerful demonstration of the different values and capabilities represented by the opposing sides in the Pacific conflict. Corporal O'Connor's Bronze Star citation was read during a ceremony attended by Marines who had fought alongside him during the hospital defense. But the real significance of his actions extended far beyond individual recognition. His evolution from a frightened replacement to a confident combat leader represented the transformation that the Marine Corps was achieving with thousands of young Americans who had never imagined they possessed the courage and capability necessary for sustained combat operations. The institutional culture that had produced such rapid development of combat effectiveness was being studied and emulated by military organizations throughout the Allied nations. The final phase of cleanup operations on Guam revealed the full extent of Japanese casualties from the failed counteroffensive. Burial details working under the supervision of Marine engineers and Navy medical personnel processed the remains of 200 enemy soldiers, providing decent interment despite the circumstances of their deaths. The respect shown for fallen enemies reflected the professional standards that distinguished American military operations and contributed to the eventual reconciliation between former adversaries. In the post-war period, intelligence gathered from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed the detailed planning that had preceded the Japanese assault on Fonte Plateau. Enemy commanders had possessed accurate information about American defensive positions, troop strengths, and tactical procedures, yet had been completely unprepared for the fighting spirit and tactical adaptability that Marine units had demonstrated during the crucial engagement. The failure of such a well-planned operation provided valuable insights into the fundamental differences between American and Japanese military cultures and their relative effectiveness under extreme combat conditions. The airfield that now occupied the Fonte Plateau became a symbol of American industrial and military capability, supporting bombing operations that would contribute directly to the eventual surrender of Japan. B-29 crews preparing for missions over the Japanese mainland taxied past memorials, marking the positions where Marines had died defending ground that was now essential to Allied victory in the Pacific. The transformation of contested battlefield into strategic asset demonstrated the broader trajectory of the war and the decisive nature of the tactical victory that had been achieved during one night of desperate fighting